Well, this is one of the most famous tables in Manchester, if not the most famous table in Manchester, because a world ideology began here. This is where Marx met Engels. Engels lived for 22 years in Manchester, and Marx would come up and visit him for months at a time. And they sat around this table. These are facsimiles of some of the books they read. And they sat around this table studying, but also reading newspapers and also writing articles for the various publications they wrote for. Engels made money from his articles, but also working with his father in Manchester. Working with his father's company. His father wasn't here. But Marx really only made money from his writings, and it was never enough, so Engels had to send him money all the time. The whole ethos of the politics behind that is really the ethos of how Manchester's newspaper industry begins in the first place, because they always had an edge. To begin with, they were either very Tory, conservative, and they were called Tory at the time, either sort of church and king, supporting that establishment, or they were radical and left. The Manchester Guardian, which is just on the table nearby, that began as a reformist paper, really as a reaction to all the events that were surrounding something called the Peterloo Massacre in Manchester. And that's important, the Peterloo Massacre, which we'll discuss later, because you don't get that at all as a nationally significant event unless you have the Fourth Estate present. So that becomes the event that leads to greater freedom, greater representation with members of Parliament, more members of Parliament, because there's 4 journalists present on the day. So without journalism, we get nothing really. And that is the inheritance within Manchester. So it's a strange thing at the moment that we don't really have a newspaper based in the city centre. The Manchester Evening News is now based outside the city centre, especially when we've just been in a building like the Printworks, a 1920s building which is absolutely vast and for a while was the centre of a printing empire and newspaper empire that was the biggest in Europe. What's Manchester Confidential? Manchester Confidential is a web-based magazine. It's got about 400,000 unique users every month. It's probably the biggest in the city. As a web magazine that's independent, it's absolutely independent. The publisher has it as independent, so we write a lot about politics, art and culture, and an awful lot about food and drinks. That gives us our advertising revenue to employ 5 journalists in effect, 17 members of staff. And we started off really because we weren't too happy with some of the coverage that was taking place in the regular newspaper, the Manchester Evening News, because that just seemed to get more and more sensationalist. I mean, the front covers, I still think, the front pages of the Evening News, I just think are shocking. You know, I've got visitors coming from all around the world, and it's always hell and death. And that's really doesn't reflect my experience, where in 21 years of being a tour guide in Manchester, I've not had a single touchwood incident. So we wanted something that also, there is some really good journalism on the Evening News, I'm not saying that, but we wanted something where in an internet article, for example, I've done interviews with Sir Richard Leese, the council leader, and it might be 4,000 words. Now you think, oh, that's far too many, unless Boris Johnson's writing it, as he was the other day. But no, it's not. If my readers want to read it, they'll read it. If they want to read it, just go off to another page. I don't care. I mean, the great thing about digital publishing is that it's utterly flexible. So you can write massive articles or short articles. You can do 10 articles a day. We tend to try and do 4 or 5 articles a day, but you can do as many as you want, and you can be absurd, stupid, funny, ridiculous, but also serious. And that's the great thing about something as flexible as Manchester Confidential. Now, the problem is with Manchester Confidential, it's like the problem with the whole of journalism at the moment, the whole of sort of newspapers, magazines, because it's a magazine, it's not a newspaper, is that where does the money come from? I think the Huffington Post editor said, who pays for the Baghdad correspondent? Because in the end, if you're just printing stuff and publishing stuff, then there's no money coming in at the moment because the advertising revenues have fallen through the floor. So that is a big challenge, certainly for print journalism, and it looks still pretty dire for print journalism. Internet journalism might exist more and more, but I think what will happen is, what we're getting now is massive move. My brother talks about this quite a lot, from a literate age where you would look at the word into much more of a visual age, and I think the internet has to be part of that. And I think in the end, for print magazines, I think what we'll just go right back to the 18th century in the old Spectator magazine in London, where there'll be a very small number of people reading a very small, well, maybe a large number, but a wide variety of small print run, specialist niche, interesting magazines, and the day-to-day newspaper, I feel, I don't know. How long are we giving it? How long are we actually giving a day-to-day printed newspaper? It won't be long, and we'll get our news daily through whatever media we're using online. So it's a terrible time for the newspapers, but it's not a bad time to be a journalist if you're flexible and you make sure that you never do anything for nothing. Never do anything for nothing once you've gone past your internship. tell people all this all the time. If they want an article, make them pay for it. I think what's happening now is that people are retreating into bunkers. I find this a massively sinister thing. When I was growing up, of course, we had 4 channels on TV. We had a certain number of papers and almost no recourse to, well, we didn't have any recourse to the internet. So say walking to school in the morning, you'd all have a common set of ideas as kids about what was in the news, depending on the newspaper a little way and what you read, or what you just watched on TV. So you all had something common to say to each other, and you all had an opinion that would feed into each other. Now people, certainly different ethnic groups, different groups can just watch their own language satellite TV or something, which is way out of the country, or if you might, for example, my sons, they sometimes have conversations with people in Japan about the games they're playing. So you don't build up this general commonality of feeling or ideas about what's going on in your country in the city, and you live in a little bunker, which is like loads of parallel universes together. And I'm worried about that in news and journalism as well, because I talk to people now who will just take online, say, for example, if the Conservative or the Daily Mail or the Daily Telegraph, and they won't. And it's the easiest thing to click over to see what the Guardian's saying, but they just don't. You know, and they stick in these bunkers, and I worry about that, because really, I'll read you a quote at some point from C.P. Scott, the Manchester Guardian editor, long-time Manchester Guardian editor, a long time ago, and he says that you have to put the contrary view in every article you do. So it's not enough just to have a massive Daily Mail rant about Brexit or something, but then don't put the opposite argument. It's just not enough, that. But that is what's happening more and more. It's just people, basically, they're not articles or newspaper articles anymore. They're a single-minded, tunnel vision rant. And that impartiality of the good journalist is really, really being hit hard by commercialities where you've got to do sensationalism and try and get people to have clicks on your website. So I'm terrified about that lack of impartiality that's cropping up.